In 1859, a respectable London woman named Mrs. Whitmore visited her physician with a list of symptoms: anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and what she delicately called nervous episodes. Her doctor, following the best medical practice of the day, diagnosed her with hysteria and prescribed a treatment that would make modern medical boards revoke his license instantly. He placed her on an examination table and manually stimulated her genitals until she experienced what he clinically documented as hysterical paroxysm. This wasn't some hidden, shameful practice. This was medicine, respectable, routine, and prescribed across Europe and America by men who believed themselves healers. What makes it more unsettling is that it was not born out of kindness, nor out of genuine understanding of women's health. It was born out of fear, ignorance, and a world that refused to listen to women unless they were writhing in silence. The diagnosis of hysteria was as old as civilization itself. Ancient physicians once claimed a woman's womb wandered inside her body like a wild animal, creating madness, melancholy, and strange desires. Centuries later, the idea persisted. By the 19th century, nearly 1 in every 4 women was said to suffer from hysteria, a disease so vague it could mean almost anything: sadness, anger, disobedience, or simply existing in ways men did not approve of. The treatment, however, was chillingly consistent. Rather than asking questions, rather than listening, doctors turned to a ritual of control disguised as cure. The very act of touching, of forcing a release, was documented not as intimacy or exploitation, but as medicine. Each note in the physician's record was clinical, detached, stripped of humanity. Yet what those women experienced was far from detached. Imagine the scene: the gas-lit office, the heavy drapes drawn tight, the polished instruments neatly arranged on oak shelves. A woman, pale and trembling, lies on the table, her reputation balancing on the doctor's discretion. She has no voice here, only symptoms to be catalogued and a body to be corrected. The physician bends over her not with compassion, but with authority, his hands working with mechanical precision as if her pain were nothing more than another routine procedure. And when it was done, when her body had been driven to an involuntary conclusion, he would snap his notebook shut, satisfied that he had once again restored balance to a disordered female mind. She would rise from the table shaken, shamed, but told she was cured, at least until the next episode brought her crawling back to the same door. For over 2 millennia, this was considered normal. Generations of women endured it, never given the language to question, never given the power to refuse. The cruelest part of all was not the treatment itself, but the silence that surrounded it, the silence of a world where women's voices were dismissed as sickness, where their pain became a joke, and where their bodies became instruments for a false cure. This is not just a story about medical history. It is a story about power, about the ways science can be twisted into control, about how entire generations of women were told that their suffering was imaginary, only to be treated with something far worse than the disease itself. And as Mrs. Whitmore walked out of that clinic in 1859, unaware of how many had come before her, she had no way of knowing the truth, that her story was not hers alone. It was part of a dark tradition that would shape medicine, sexuality, and women's lives for centuries to come. London, 1859. A city that prided itself on progress and order, yet beneath the surface of gaslight and cobblestones lay a world of secrets. Fog rolled through the narrow alleys, swallowing the cries of street hawkers and the clatter of carriage wheels. To the wealthy, London was civilization at its height, a place of refinement, invention, and science. But for women like Mrs. Whitmore, even in the finest homes, progress was nothing more than a gilded cage. Mrs. Whitmore had grown up knowing her place. Daughter of a respectable merchant, wife to a banker with polished shoes and an immaculate reputation, she lived in a townhouse where curtains were drawn at the same hour each evening, and servants moved quietly, as though part of the furniture. She was a woman admired at church, welcomed at teas, and spoken of with the kind of restrained approval that marked true respectability. Yet behind that facade, her nights were restless, her thoughts sharp with unease. Her body betrayed her in ways no one would name aloud. Sleeplessness, sudden bursts of tears, a racing heart at the quietest hour of night. She had called them nervous episodes, the only language polite enough to veil the truth. What terrified her most was not the symptoms, but the silence. In a society where a woman's worth was measured in obedience and composure, to confess weakness was to risk everything. Doctors had a word for women like her: hysteria. It was a diagnosis that needed no test, no proof, no explanation. To men of science, it was a convenient label for the countless ways women's voices, anger, or even exhaustion refused to fit into their tidy picture of the world. The history of hysteria stretched back 2,000 years, an inheritance of superstition cloaked in medical authority. Once, philosophers claimed, the womb wandered inside the female body like a restless creature. Now, in the polished offices of London, the same fantasy wore a stethoscope and was written in Latin across clinical notes. Her physician, Dr. Pembroke, carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he was serving both medicine and morality. To him, Mrs. Whitmore's trembling hands and sleepless eyes were not signs of her struggles as a woman trapped in a stifling world, but evidence of disease. The treatment was simple, he explained, mechanical, efficient, entirely proper. She need not concern herself with the details. And so she found herself lying on the table, the drapes drawn against the city beyond. The air smelled of ink and linseed oil, the faint scent of leather-bound books stacked high on shelves. The ritual that followed was couched in formality. Every movement recorded in his neat handwriting, every spasm of her body reduced to clinical jargon. To him, it was science. To her, it was something she could never name aloud. But this was not an isolated experience. All across Europe and America, women sat in waiting rooms with lowered eyes, clutching handkerchiefs, their shame carefully hidden behind lace gloves. Some came willingly, convinced that medicine would restore them to their husband's favor. Others came because there was nowhere else to go. The unspoken rule was clear: a woman's body did not belong to her. It belonged to her family, her society, and in moments like these, to her physician. Mrs. Whitmore carried the secret home with her like a shadow. She returned to her dining table, to the quiet ticking of clocks and the polite murmurs of dinner guests, as though nothing had happened. Yet in the stillness of night, when she stared at the ceiling and heard the city carriages pass, she wondered whether her sickness was real or whether the sickness lay in the world around her. The cruel irony was that her cure would never cure. Relief came, but it was fleeting. Within weeks, sometimes days, the symptoms returned: anxiety, restlessness, despair. Each time she was sent back to the same office, back to the same ritual that promised health but offered only dependence. Each time she told herself she was simply following the wisdom of learned men, that this was the burden of being a woman in a modern age. What Mrs. Whitmore could not know was that she was part of something much larger, something woven into the fabric of her time. Thousands of women across continents were being subjected to the same cycle, bound by silence, disguised as medicine. It was not their bodies that were failing them, but the society that refused to hear their voices. Her story, though wrapped in lace and manners, was not gentle. It was a story of control. Control over the female body, over female desire, over female existence itself. And though she bore it quietly, the echoes of her suffering would ripple outward, a haunting reminder of how science can become a weapon when it refuses to see humanity. For Mrs. Whitmore, the setup of her ordeal was only beginning. The weeks after her first treatment blurred into one another, each day carrying the same rhythm of duty, appearance, and silence. The world outside her window bustled with the noise of London's industrial triumphs, steam engines rattling along iron tracks, newspapers announcing inventions that promised to change the future, men debating politics in smoke-filled clubs. Yet inside her own home, Mrs. Whitmore carried a secret that progress could not touch. Her symptoms never truly disappeared. At breakfast, she would smile across the polished table, lifting her teacup with steady hands, but at night those same hands trembled when she was alone. Her husband noticed only enough to suggest another visit to the doctor, his words framed as concern but carrying the unspoken weight of expectation. A respectable wife must be calm, pleasing, without complaint. Medicine, he believed, would keep her that way. And so the pattern began. Each time she returned to Dr. Pembroke's office, the ritual unfolded the same way, the heavy curtains drawn against the daylight, the odor of disinfectant barely masking something more intimate. The doctor's practiced detachment as he performed what he insisted was treatment. His notes grew into a ledger of her supposed disorder, dates, symptoms, his interventions, the recorded success of induced paroxysm. Each entry stripped her humanity down to numbers and phrases, as though her life could be measured in spasms and silences. For Mrs. Whitmore, the experience was confusing. Shame pressed on her like a weight, but alongside it was a fleeting sense of relief she could not name. That relief vanished quickly, replaced by dread at the knowledge she would soon be sent back again. What unsettled her most was not only the act itself, but how ordinary it seemed within the walls of that office. She was not the only one. Sometimes when she arrived early, she saw other women leaving, faces flushed, eyes lowered, handkerchiefs clutched tightly. None spoke a word. Their silence was a pact, unspoken but unbreakable. In drawing rooms and parlours across London, hysteria was whispered about almost fashionably. Newspapers referred to it as the most common ailment of middle and upper-class women, proof, some claimed, of the delicate female constitution. Husbands joked about it after dinner. Doctors discussed it as though it were no more serious than a cough. But to the women themselves it was a quiet torment. Their emotions were pathologized, their dissatisfaction branded as sickness, their cries for autonomy reduced to symptoms in a man's notebook. Mrs. Whitmore began to notice the ways society itself conspired to keep her silent. At church, sermons reminded women of their divine duty to obey. At social gatherings, any mention of fatigue or unhappiness was dismissed with polite laughter. Even in her own home, her moments of anger or melancholy were met with her husband's frown and a suggestion to return to the physician. The walls of respectability closed in tighter with every passing day. And yet a part of her began to awaken. In sleepless nights staring into the darkness, she wondered if hysteria was truly a disease at all. If nearly every woman she knew suffered from it, could it really be illness? Or was it the natural cry of lives suffocated by silence? That thought frightened her more than the treatment itself. Because if it were true, then the sickness was not in her body. It was in the world around her. The pattern dragged on season after season. Each visit blurred into the next, her body compelled into obedience, her spirit sinking under the weight of secrecy. But with every ritual came a deeper unease, a growing sense that what she endured was not medicine, but a disguised form of control. What she did not yet know was that this unease would grow into something darker. And her story, though hidden behind the polished windows of Victorian London, was part of a much larger history, one that stretched back centuries and would leave scars far beyond her own lifetime. By autumn of 1859, Mrs. Whitmore's routine had hardened into a cycle as predictable as the changing seasons. Her mornings began with the careful rituals of domestic respectability, the silver laid out for breakfast, the polite nod to the maid, the quiet walk to church on Sundays. To outsiders she embodied order and grace, the very model of a Victorian wife. But inside, beneath the starched fabric of her gowns and the polite curve of her smile, a storm brewed endlessly. Her husband never questioned the frequency of her visits to Dr. Pembroke. In fact, he encouraged them, believing it reflected well upon his household that he provided for his wife's medical needs. For him, her silence was proof that the treatments worked. But for Mrs. Whitmore, every carriage ride to the doctor's office felt like a slow descent into a ritual she dreaded, yet could not escape. In the waiting room, she learned to keep her eyes lowered. Other women sat in stiff chairs, their hands resting on reticules, their faces marked by the same quiet dread she felt. The silence was heavy, as though each one feared that speaking would shatter the fragile pretense that they were there for something ordinary. And when they emerged one by one, their cheeks flushed and expressions stiff, she recognized in them a mirror of her own secret shame. The physician's office was always the same. The smell of ink and disinfectant, the drapes drawn so tightly that the city beyond might as well have vanished. Dr. Pembroke greeted her with a professional smile, his tone smooth, his notes ready. To him she was not a woman with fears, doubts, or desires. She was a case, an entry in his growing record of hysteria. His treatment was clinical, detached, and disturbingly efficient. What happened within those four walls was never acknowledged outside them. Each time Mrs. Whitmore left feeling fractured. Her body responded to the treatment as he predicted, but her soul recoiled. Relief came, but it was laced with guilt. She told herself she was simply following medical advice, that it was better to endure quietly than to question. After all, questioning was not permitted. Women who resisted were labeled hysterical all the more, their refusal treated as further proof of their illness. At home, her isolation deepened. The walls of her townhouse seemed to close in, every portrait and polished mirror reminding her of the life she was expected to perform. Servants came and went, careful never to notice the change in her eyes. Guests arrived for dinners, speaking of politics, business, and the latest gossip, their laughter ringing through rooms that felt increasingly suffocating. Not once did anyone ask how she truly felt. Respectability demanded silence, and silence she delivered. As the weeks dragged on, her thoughts began to darken. She wondered if other women too lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, and questioning whether they were truly sick, or whether they had been convinced of an illness that never existed. Could it be that hysteria was nothing more than a label, a weapon used to keep them in place? Each time she considered the idea, fear gripped her. To think such a thought was dangerous, for it challenged not only her doctor, but the entire foundation of the world she lived in. The cruelest truth was that her suffering was invisible to those around her. Her husband praised her composure, her friends admired her refinement, society applauded her quietness. To them she was the perfect wife, but inside she felt herself shrinking, her sense of self eroded by treatments that promised health while robbing her of dignity. She was a prisoner whose chains were polished until they gleamed like jewelry. And yet beneath the weight of this despair, a seed of defiance began to stir. She started noticing the patterns more clearly. The way nearly every woman of her class was sent for similar treatments, the way doctors dismissed their words while profiting from their visits, the way society mocked their pain but feared their voices. It was not she who was broken, she realized, but the system that surrounded her. A system that had existed for centuries, dressed up in the language of medicine and morality, but rooted in control. Mrs. Whitmore's story was not unique. Across Europe and America, women of every age found themselves subjected to the same humiliating cures, silenced by the same diagnoses. Their suffering was not an accident. It was a tradition. And like all traditions built on silence, it thrived because no one dared to speak. Winter came early that year, and with it, the sharp chill of London fog that clung to every street corner. Mrs. Whitmore felt the cold sink deeper into her bones than ever before. Though she could not say whether it came from the weather or from the endless treatments that had become her routine, each visit left her hollow, each return home wrapped in silence. Her husband continued to smile with quiet satisfaction, believing that medicine had restored balance to his household. But Mrs. Whitmore knew the truth. Nothing had been healed. The treatments dulled her restlessness for hours, sometimes days, but the unease always returned. What gnawed at her was not an illness in her body, but the absence of freedom in her life. She had begun to notice patterns more sharply now. At church, women fainted during sermons. At social gatherings, their laughter was brittle, too polished. Even in whispered conversations behind closed doors, she caught glimpses of the same exhaustion, the same dread that filled her nights. Hysteria, she realized, was not a sickness at all. It was a cage, built from centuries of obedience and silence, wrapped in the language of medicine so men could pretend it was science. One night, sitting alone in her parlor while the city outside roared with carriages and factory bells, she let herself ask the question she had avoided for months. What if none of us are sick? What if the sickness is in them, in the world that demands our silence, our submission, our shame? The thought terrified her, yet it also gave her the first flicker of strength she had felt in years. She could not speak it aloud, not yet. But she carried it within her, a fragile ember of defiance against a world determined to keep her quiet. And though she did not know it, her story was not hers alone. Across Europe and America, countless women sat in drawing rooms and doctors' offices, enduring the same rituals, questioning in silence, waiting for a time when their voices could no longer be dismissed. Her suffering was part of something larger, a hidden history stretching back centuries, a history that would one day be forced into the light. By the early months of 1860, Mrs. Whitmore's days had taken on the cadence of a life she no longer recognized as her own. From the outside, she was the portrait of Victorian composure, her dresses immaculately pressed, her voice polite and measured, her duties executed without complaint. Yet inside, She felt as though she were drifting further from herself with every passing week, her identity eroded by the rituals imposed upon her. Her visits to Dr. Pembroke no longer shocked her in the way they once had. The shame had dulled into a strange kind of numbness. She lay on the examination table, the heavy drapes drawn tight, and surrendered to the clinical routine. But now she noticed something else, the doctor's indifference. He rarely looked her in the eyes, rarely acknowledged her as a person. She was not a woman to him, but a mechanism, her body a problem to be manipulated until it performed the expected response. His ledger grew thicker with each visit, but to her it felt as though he was writing her humanity out of existence. It was during one of these sessions that she noticed for the first time another patient's name scribbled in the margins of his notes. A mistake, perhaps. He must have left the page visible on his desk. The name was unfamiliar to her, but the realization was staggering. She was not just one of many. She was part of a stream, a procession of women processed and catalogued, their pain transformed into clinical data. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her husband's steady breathing beside her. She felt her heart racing with the thought that her suffering was not private, but communal, that across the city, perhaps across the world, other women lay in the same silence. This realization brought her no comfort. Instead, it filled her with a deeper kind of sorrow, because it meant the injustice was larger than she could ever have imagined. Her suspicions grew as she began to observe the women around her more closely. At a winter luncheon, she noticed how Lady Havisham's hands shook as she reached for her teacup, how Mrs. Dutton's eyes seemed red from nights of sleeplessness. Their conversations danced around trivialities, fashion, the weather, the latest scandal, but behind their words was the same hollowness she carried. In their laughter she heard exhaustion. In their silence she heard despair. It was then that Mrs. Whitmore began to feel the stirrings of anger. Not the quiet frustration she had carried before, but a sharper, hotter anger at the deception that bound them all. For centuries, men had labeled women's discontent as sickness, had cloaked their own fears in the language of science. To them, hysteria was not just an illness, it was a convenient truth, a diagnosis that silenced dissent, disguised oppression, and transformed female suffering into a business. The anger frightened her. She was not accustomed to it. Anger in women was itself considered a symptom, another mark of hysteria, and so she kept it buried, locked behind her quiet smile. But it simmered nonetheless, growing stronger with each passing day. Her health, too, began to decline in ways the doctor could not control. She grew weaker, her appetite fading, her nights consumed by vivid dreams. She saw herself in those dreams walking through endless corridors lined with doors, each door leading to a room where another woman sat silently, waiting her turn on the examination table. No matter how many doors she opened, the rooms never ended. She always woke in a cold sweat, trembling, unable to shake the image. The city outside seemed to mock her suffering with its constant noise of progress. Trains thundered along new lines, newspapers celebrated inventions, men boasted of empire and industry, but all this progress excluded her. It marched forward without women, or rather upon women, using their silence as its foundation. The realization deepened one evening when she overheard her husband speaking with a colleague. They joked casually about women's delicate constitutions, about hysteria being the inevitable result of too much reading, too much thinking, too much imagination. They laughed as though it were harmless. To them, women's pain was entertainment, another story to tell over brandy. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the hallway, her hands clenched at her sides, her body trembling with fury. For the first time she wanted to scream, but she did not. She could not. Instead, she carried her silence back to her room, her heart pounding with a new, dangerous knowledge. The world around her would never admit the truth of her suffering. If she were to survive it, she would have to see the truth for herself, even if no one else dared to speak it aloud. By the spring of 1860, Mrs. Whitmore's world had become a labyrinth of silence. Each day followed the same suffocating rhythm: polite meals, dutiful visits, evenings spent in parlors filled with hollow conversation. But beneath the surface, a storm grew stronger, tightening its grip on her heart and mind. Her visits to Dr. Pembroke no longer shocked her. They enraged her. She watched his hands move with practiced detachment, his face calm as he recorded her progress. To him, she was a subject, a specimen, nothing more. She noticed now how his notes resembled a merchant's ledger. Columns, dates, outcomes. Except instead of profit and loss, they tracked women's suffering disguised as science. One morning she entered his office to find a drawer left slightly open. Papers spilled across the desk, lists of names, times, treatments rendered. Dozens of women, their identities reduced to data points, their pain catalogued like inventory. She felt her stomach twist as she realized the sheer scale of it. This was not medicine. This was an industry. The knowledge poisoned everything around her. At gatherings, she began to see through the painted smiles of other women. Lady Havisham's trembling hands, Mrs. Dutton's hollow laughter, Miss Armitage's sudden fainting spells, all were signs of the same hidden torment. They were bound together, unwilling participants in a ritual that masqueraded as healing. Each time their eyes met across a room, there was a flicker of recognition, quickly extinguished by the fear of being exposed. The more she saw, the more her anger grew. It burned quietly at first, hidden beneath layers of propriety, but it spread, gnawing at her silence until it became unbearable. She began to wonder what would happen if she refused to return. What if she told her husband no? What if she walked into Pembroke's office and demanded answers? But she knew the truth. Defiance would not free her. It would condemn her further. A woman who refused treatment was not considered healthy. She was considered mad. At night the dreams returned. Endless corridors, endless rooms, women waiting in silence. Some stared blankly ahead. Others wept quietly, but all were trapped. The rooms multiplied endlessly, until the weight of it crushed her chest and jolted her awake. She would sit in the dark, her hands clutching the bedsheets, trying to calm her racing heart. Her husband remained blind. He spoke of business, of politics, of the empire's triumphs, never once suspecting the abyss opening inside his home. He believed her treatments made her docile, manageable, proof of his household's order. He mistook her silence for stability, never realizing it was a silence born of despair. But the mask began to crack. One evening, as she poured tea for guests, her hand trembled and the china cup shattered against the floor. The sound silenced the room. For a moment all eyes were upon her. She felt exposed, raw, as though the secret she had carried so long now hovered in the air for everyone to see. Quickly her husband dismissed it with a laugh, blaming her nerves. The word stung like a blade. It reduced her breaking point to a symptom, her humanity to an ailment. That night she wept in silence, not for the broken cup but for herself, for the countless women like her, trapped in gilded cages, their voices stolen by the very men who claimed to heal them. It was then that something within her shifted. She could not speak her truth aloud, not yet, but she carried it as a private vow. She would no longer believe in the sickness they assigned her. She would no longer surrender her suffering to their ledgers. Whether or not she found freedom in her lifetime, she would know this much. She was not broken. The system was. Her story was not hers alone. In drawing rooms across Europe, in clinics in America, women endured the same rituals, bound by the same silence. They were made to believe their unhappiness was illness. Their anger was madness, their exhaustion was disease. And though they could not yet raise their voices, the weight of their unspoken truth gathered like storm clouds, waiting for the moment when silence would finally break. Mrs. Whitmore did not know when that moment would come, but she felt it, like thunder in the distance, faint yet undeniable. Her reckoning was approaching, one that would not be confined by drapes or ledgers. For too long their bodies had been treated as battlegrounds, their emotions dismissed as symptoms. One day, the world would be forced to face the truth it had buried. And in that quiet realization, for the first time in months, she felt something stir in her chest. Not relief, not joy, but the first fragile spark of defiance. A spark that, once lit, could never fully be extinguished. The summer of 1860 arrived heavy with heat, and with it, the final breaking point of Mrs. Whitmore's long silence. Her body grew weaker, her nerves frayed, her nights haunted by dreams that left her trembling and drenched in sweat. Each visit to Dr. Pembroke no longer numbed her. It enraged her. She began to see every detail, the flick of his wrist as he wrote in his ledger, the indifference in his eyes, the way he dismissed her humanity with the stroke of a pen. One afternoon, as she sat once more in the examination room, the curtains drawn tight, The familiar ritual began, but this time, something inside her snapped. For months she had lain quietly, a patient, an object, but now her silence erupted into a tremor that shook her entire being. She pulled her hands away from the table, her breath sharp and ragged, her voice breaking through the stillness. "Stop!" The word was small, but in the silence of that office it felt like thunder. Dr. Pembroke froze, startled. His face hardened quickly, his professional calm masking irritation. Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone patronizing, "this is necessary. Without it, your nerves will worsen. You do not understand the importance." But she was no longer listening. For the first time she looked directly into his eyes, not as a patient, not as a woman to be subdued, but as a human being confronting the man who had hidden behind the mask of medicine. She saw him not as a healer, but as a gatekeeper of control, a man who had turned women's suffering into routine. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. The weight of every visit, every humiliation, every night of silence surged through her veins. And in that moment she realized the truth. Hysteria was never a sickness within her. It was the sickness of a society that refused to let women be human. Dr. Pembroke's words faded into the background. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp and defiant. For the first time, she chose to leave the room without permission. His protests followed her, warnings that her condition would worsen, that she was endangering herself. But she knew better. What endangered her was submission, not defiance. Outside, the London air hit her face like a flood. The city roared around her, carriages rattling, vendors shouting, smoke curling into the sky. It was no less oppressive than before, but for the first time she walked its streets with her own will. Each step felt heavy, but each was also a rebellion. That night, when her husband asked about her visit, she did not answer. She stared at him in silence, her face calm but unreadable. His irritation grew, but she no longer cared. The chains of expectation had not vanished, but she had loosened them enough to breathe. The climax of her struggle was not dramatic in the way stories often are. There were no speeches, no public declarations. Her defiance was quiet, private, but it was real. For a woman of her time, even a whisper of resistance was an earthquake. In the days that followed, she knew she would be pressured to return. Her husband would insist, the doctor would call, society would demand her compliance. But something within her had shifted forever. She had spoken a single word, stop, and in doing so she had broken the spell of silence that had bound her. That moment, small as it seemed, was everything. It was the spark in the darkness, the heartbeat of rebellion that carried within it the weight of countless other women. Her story was not the end. It was one thread in a vast tapestry of resistance, woven quietly across drawing rooms, kitchens, and clinics, waiting for the day when whispers would swell into a roar. The weeks after Mrs. Whitmore's quiet rebellion were filled with unease, but also with a new clarity. She had not cured herself, nor escaped the weight of her society. The expectations still pressed on her shoulders. Her husband still spoke of doctors and nerves, and the city around her marched on with its endless noise of progress. But something fundamental had changed. She no longer believed the story they told her. For years she had accepted the word hysteria as truth, had allowed physicians and husbands to define her body and her mind. Now she carried within her a different truth, that her suffering was not sickness but resistance, her silence not weakness but survival. The shame she once felt after each treatment had given way to anger, and from that anger a fragile but unyielding strength. It was not freedom, not yet. But it was a beginning. In small ways she began to resist. She delayed appointments, feigned improvement, insisted on choosing how her days were spent. Her husband, puzzled by her newfound stubbornness, grew frustrated, but she did not bend. She understood now that her life was not hers alone, that every small act of defiance was a thread in something larger, something centuries in the making. Because Mrs. Whitmore's story was not isolated. Across London, across Europe, across the Atlantic, in America, women lived parallel lives of silence and suppression. They endured the same diagnoses, the same humiliating cures, the same endless dismissal of their voices. They too dreamed at night of corridors filled with women waiting, waiting, waiting. And like her, many began to carry the dangerous thought, perhaps we are not broken at all. History would not record their whispers, their shattered teacups, their quiet refusals. But those whispers mattered. They gathered in the shadows, multiplying, until the world could no longer ignore them. Decades later, women would begin to demand new truths about medicine, about marriage, about freedom itself. The storm Mrs. Whitmore once felt in the distance would finally break. She would not live to see it. She would remain in her lifetime a figure trapped between silence and defiance, her rebellion invisible to the world around her. But she would carry with her the knowledge that she was not alone. And that knowledge, quiet though it was, became her survival. The impact of her story lies not in grand gestures, but in what it reveals: how entire systems can disguise control as care, how oppression can hide behind respectability, how suffering can be written off as science. Her life asks us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the horrors of her time are not buried in the past. They echo still in the ways voices are silenced, bodies controlled, and pain dismissed. So we are left with a question, one that lingers long after her footsteps fade. How many Mrs. Whitmores still walk among us, carrying silence, branded as broken, when in truth it is the world that is sick?